Open up any sports media feed, and you will immediately see a deep obsession with highlight reel goals, specifically the plays where one guy takes the ball from deep in his own territory and single-handedly runs right through the entire opposing team. There is an exact formula to these viral clips. The player picks the ball up near the halfway line, wriggles past 4 or 5 different defenders, and relies entirely on pure individual acceleration to make it into the box. This checklist breaks down the mathematical reality of these plays. To pull this off, you need a massive sequence of highly unlikely events to align perfectly, starting from the halfway line, beating 4 or more defenders in a row, maintaining extreme acceleration under pressure, and somehow keeping complete composure for the finish. The problem is that developing athletes and youth coaches watch these highly improbable sequences on loop and mistakenly build their baseline training regimens around trying to replicate them. Basing your daily practice on a statistical anomaly guarantees you will fail to develop the realistic tactical skills you actually need on the pitch. To figure out exactly why training for those highlight moments costs you so much over a season, we need to compare 2 very different paths to elite offensive production. First, we have Archetype A, the solo playmaker. Look at the posture here, the extremely low center of gravity and the tight ball control. This player relies heavily on unique biomechanical agility to physically beat defenders on deep-lying runs. Then we have Archetype B, the optimized finisher. Notice the striking motion and physical framing. This alternative model ignores deep dribbling and instead focuses on off-ball spatial positioning, integrating into a broader team system, and pure penalty box efficiency. For a coach building a team or a player mapping their development, the choice comes down to the long-term return on investment for each style. People usually turn this comparison into a toxic fanboy debate, but we have to ignore that noise. The only accurate way to evaluate these models is by looking strictly at biomechanics and statistical probability. The development path you choose here entirely dictates your team's structural vulnerability on defense and your absolute ceiling on offense. Let's start with the specific physical inputs required to execute that wriggling, tiptoeing acceleration we hear commentators praise in the viral clips. To successfully bypass a low defensive block without using your teammates to pass the ball around it, you must possess a highly specific genetic baseline, primarily an exceptionally low center of gravity. Operating this way comes with severe spatial constraints. A player utilizing this method intentionally invites pressure from multiple defenders simultaneously, leaving almost zero margin for physical error. This approach creates a high turnover risk. Every failed dribble leaves the rest of the team instantly exposed to a counterattack because the defensive structure was bypassed to support the run. This flowchart maps out the actual risk during a single possession. If you beat the first defender, you might have a 60% success rate, but the compounding risk factor of taking on consecutive defenders means your success rate drops to 30% against the second guy and plummets to 10% against the third. When that probability inevitably hits 0 and the ball is lost, the entire offensive structure fails because no teammates were utilized to progress the play. You cannot systematically drill elite hip mobility and a uniquely low center of gravity into an average athlete in the gym. Those are genetic traits you either have or you don't. Building your strategy around the solo playmaker archetype is a high-risk gamble on rare genetics, rather than a reliable blueprint for teachable skills. Now, let's examine the exact tactical scenario celebrated in the source material, a player starting an attacking run from their own halfway line. The reward is obvious. If it actually works, a run from deep completely collapses the opponent's defensive shape by drawing players out of position and creating massive numerical advantages. This comparison matrix weighs that potential reward against the actual costs. We need to compare the deep-lying dribbler against the optimized finisher, strictly in terms of energy expenditure and tactical risk. Look at the left column. Archetype A requires a massive anaerobic energy cost, carrying the ball over 50 yards while absorbing constant physical contact from defenders drains the legs incredibly fast. On the right, Archetype B conserves that energy by operating almost entirely in the final third. They rely on their teammates to progress the ball up the pitch. If a deep-lying dribbler loses the ball in the middle third of the pitch, the defensive exposure is severe. The rest of the team has usually pushed forward, anticipating the attack, leaving huge gaps behind them. Because these runs are completely unpredictable and based entirely on player instinct, it is impossible for a coach to build a synchronized, reliable tactical system around them. The deep run strategy prioritizes individual brilliance at the severe expense of team stability and consistent energy management throughout a full 90-minute match. Let's shift our focus completely to Archetype B, the alternative path that integrates players into a system rather than leaving them to isolate individual defenders. The primary inputs for this optimized model are elite off-ball movement, precise spatial positioning, and clinical one-touch execution. A system-integrated player utilizes spatial awareness to dictate play. Notice the head-up posture and the distinct separation from the defenders here. By operating in open space, they completely remove the need for extreme acceleration or physical dominance. The major advantage of this approach is replicability. You can successfully drill spatial awareness and timing into an entire squad, regardless of their innate physical builds. This approach directly mitigates the high turnover risks we looked at earlier. A rapid, structured passing sequence is mathematically much harder for a defense to stop than a single player attempting a dribble. System integration gives you an offensive output that is mathematically safer, significantly less exhausting, and vastly more consistent than praying for a solo miracle every weekend. Those impossible highlight reel goals are incredible to watch as a fan, but they serve as the absolute worst possible blueprints for your long-term athletic and tactical development. This chart plots effort against realistic impact to map developmental return on investment. Notice halfway line solo dribbles. They fall into the extreme quadrant of high effort and low impact. Compare that to system integration, locking directly into the medium effort, high impact quadrant. If you are a developing athlete and you lack the highly precise biomechanical anomaly of rapid, low-gravity acceleration, you need to divest your training hours away from deep dribbling and reinvest them into one-touch finishing. And for the youth coaches watching, stop designing fragile tactics requiring your best player to physically beat 3 opponents just to get a shot on target. You are much better off investing your limited weekly practice hours into drilling repeatable passing triangles and systematic overloads that the whole squad can execute. True elite efficacy doesn't come from trying to force an impossible statistical anomaly. It comes from mastering highly optimized, repeatable systems that actually win games on a consistent basis.